The One and the Many, Yogacara Buddhism and Husserl, by M.G. Larrabee. Introduction. Among the teachings of the Buddhist school of Yogacara, the doctrine of the ālayavijñāna, or ālaya for short, is especially unique and perplexing. The Yogacara or Vijñānavāda school evolved between 350 and 500 AD, stimulating other followers in India and China into the 9th century. The school posits a form of subjective idealism, partially in reaction to the movement begun by Nāgārjuna in the 2nd century AD, a philosophy which had denied the reality of both the empirical world and the self. Yogacara attempts to establish the reality of the self as consciousness in order to overcome the skepticism and nihilism engendered by Nāgārjuna's teachings. The doctrine of the ālayavijñāna, storehouse consciousness, is central to Yogacara metaphysics, but it appears impervious to a clearly defined conceptual interpretation. At times, the ālaya seems to be only one of many elements of consciousness, all possessing more or less equal stature. At other times, however, the ālaya seems to take on a predominant and fundamental role, separating itself from the elements of any particular consciousness and laying claim to a metaphysical status which amounts to the source of particularity within the spatio-temporal world as ordinarily experienced. Commentators mirroring one or another aspect of this fluctuation have likened the ālaya to both Freud's unconscious, an ego-centered and particularized phenomenon, although with a general shared structure, and Jung's collective unconscious, a basic, universally specified phenomenon which underlies any particularized ego. In this article, I wish to sketch an additional comparison, in this instance between the ālayavijñāna of Buddhist idealism and the flux of Husserlian idealism, a structure also termed inner time consciousness. In particular, I will show the extent to which one phase of Husserl's notion of consciousness can illuminate some of the theoretical problems which emerge from the doctrine of the ālaya. As we shall see, the similarities between the flux and the ālaya may stem, in part, from attempts on the part of both philosophies to ground the particularity of the ego-experienced spatio-temporal realm in a primordial consciousness of some sort. The article will take the following course. I will first outline the important points of the Yogacara system, with emphasis on the doctrine of the ālaya and its mode of operation. Next, I will discuss the Husserlian notion of the flux and compare it with the ālaya in a preliminary way. The final section will be an effort at extending the metaphysical implications of the comparison to its furthest point. Hopefully, some additional insight into the problems inherent in the doctrine of the ālaya will result. 1. The doctrine of the ālayavijñāna. The Yogacara school of Buddhism, with the aid of Western philosophical terminology, can be described as a metaphysical idealism. Its main advocates were Asanga and Vasubandhu, who in the late 4th century drew inspiration from earlier, and for us anonymous, sutras, in particular the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra and the Lankavatara Sutra. The Yogacarans held that only consciousness is real. Consequently, neither the external objective world nor the internal egological world exists. Both types of reality are the result of transformations of consciousness. The various arguments which the Yogacarans set forth to defend their idealism will not be discussed here, since our interest concerns only the description of how consciousness operates. This description begins with the positing of 8 types of consciousness. This multiplicity on the part of consciousness is intended to explain the different functions by which consciousness apparently creates the illusions of an existing spatio-temporal world and the internal ego worlds. These 8 types of consciousness are the 5 external senses, vision, hearing, and so on, which count as the 1st through the 5th consciousnesses, an internal sense center, 6th, the mind or the discriminating consciousness termed manovijñāna, 7th, and the ālaya, 8th, also called storehouse or home consciousness, receptacle or appropriating consciousness, or seed consciousness. This 8th consciousness is, however, first in the order of importance with respect to generating the movement from the oneness of true being as consciousness to the multiplicity of apparent beings within the spatio-temporal world, including, of course, the many empirical consciousnesses, human persons. It is termed the first transformation of consciousness as derivable from what might be described as the pure or real state of consciousness. Consequently, it is the ground or condition for the operation of the other transformations of consciousness which take place in the functioning of mind, the second transformation, and the 6 senses, the third transformation. What then is the ālayavijñāna, the eighth type of consciousness? Asanga, in his Mahayana Sangraha, summarizes its nature as follows. All actions, dharmas, which are blemished, lodge in it the quality of fruit, and it itself lodges in these dharmas in the quality of cause, hetu bhavana. The ālaya, then, has a twofold character. It receives and stores the fruit of actions and perceptions, the dharmas, in the form of seeds, and it causes further actions and perceptions on the basis of these seeds. In short, it is both caused by and causes dharmas. We may note at this point that this dual character of the ālaya answers one problem which besets any idealism. If neither enduring spatio-temporal objects nor enduring subject egos exist, how can the regularity, consistency, and continuity of our experience be explained? The Yogacarans claim that these characteristics of experience flow from the causal force of the seeds on the ālaya, seeds which regularly perfume the other consciousnesses, as the original texts express it, in a specific way, which gives rise again and again to the same manifestations, for example, the apparently subsisting trees, birds, and so on. Thus, my experience of myself as an enduring subject arises regularly because the ālaya receives the fruit, effects of a mind, mano-vijñāna, which illusorily posits myself as an enduring entity. This illusory belief, in turn, is caused by the seeds of the ālaya operating on the mind. The interplay of reciprocally affecting ālaya and manas perpetuates the belief in an enduring self, and the perpetuation of the belief leads to the assumption of the real existence of a self, which is the object of that belief. In the same way, the experience of enduring physical objects in an enduring spatio-temporal world derives its continuity and consistency from the mutual causation between the ālaya and the other 7 types of consciousness. Thus far, the doctrine of the ālaya appears to cohere well with the basic idealistic position of the Yogacara school. However, certain difficulties arise upon closer investigation. First, what is the proper character of the ālaya? To be consistent with their adherence to the no-soul doctrine of the Buddha, the Yogacarans cannot view it as an enduring soul-like container which holds the constantly passing seeds. On the other hand, they do not want to claim that the ālaya is equivalent in structure with these seeds. The latter interpretation would result in a continuous defilement by the non-ālaya consciousness causing the seeds, thus rendering impossible the attainment of nirvana, that pure state of consciousness defined by the cessation of such defilements. Asanga does not resolve this problem. He states only, these seeds are substantially neither different from nor identical with the receptacle consciousness, ālayavijñāna. But this statement merely reiterates the preceding position in an ambiguous and paradoxical manner. The seeds cannot be different from the ālaya because then the ālaya would be an enduring substratum underlying the momentary seeds, all of which are distinct from it. On the other hand, the seeds cannot be equivalent to the ālaya because then no consciousness free from the defilements of these seeds would be possible. But if the ālaya can be characterized in neither of these ways, how then can it be characterized? A second and related difficulty concerns the predication of number to the ālaya. Is it one or many? The texts themselves do not resolve this issue, although certain indications are available. There are 2 predominant interpretations on this point. First, the ālaya is one, but materializes at many points as individual consciousnesses, which are empirically but erroneously viewed as individual ego-centered persons. Second, the ālaya is many, that is, each individual person has an ālaya as one of the 8 consciousnesses which make up that individual. As we can see, the latter interpretation emphasizes the psychological descriptive aspect of the Yogacara doctrine, while the former highlights the metaphysical or ontological aspect. The psychological view was taken by Xuanzang, a 7th century Chinese follower and interpreter of the Yogacara school. He notes in his commentary on Vasubandhu's 30 verses, the Cheng Weishi Lun, the word consciousness generally expresses the idea that all human beings each possess 8 consciousnesses, including the ālaya consciousness. This interpretation militates against any monistic tendencies of the doctrine of consciousness only, which at times seems to posit some single ultimate reality. For Xuanzang, such a single ultimate could not even be true thusness, tathāgatata, as many Buddhists describe the state of absolute reality reached in nirvana, since Xuanzang claimed that even tathāgatata is possessed in an individual way by each human being. Only by inferring that true thusness is one and the same in each individual, thus dissolving any and all individuality, could one arrive at a monism on Xuanzang's interpretation of the ālaya. It might be noted, however, that if one takes into account the Buddhist penchant for confounding the law of contradiction, a monistic position might be feasible by claiming that thusness is neither one, because each human being can possess it, nor many, because it is the one ultimate reality. Chuan-tsang might then be interpreted as discussing merely one common aspect of the reality of the ālaya, and thusness when he attributes both of them to individual persons. The alternative interpretation of the number of ālaya bypasses a possible collision with the Yogacara monism by asserting that the ālaya is one, but that it differentiates itself into various ego centers, which rise and fall like the waves of the ocean. Also, like the waves of the ocean, the individual ego centers are neither wholly distinct from nor wholly identical with the ālaya. In this metaphysically accented view, the ālaya acquires a more fundamental role than it has in the preceding psychological interpretation. Here, the ālaya functions as the ground for the individual ego centers and consequently as a common ground for the consistency of world experience undergone by the majority of individual human subjects. Specifically, the continuous, yet for Buddhists illusory belief engendered by the manas consciousness that a substantial world with substantially enduring ego subjects exists. This interpretation of the ālaya would, to a certain extent, accord with the Yogacara doctrine of the triple nature of reality. Reality is one, monism, but appears as either perfected, dependent, or imagined, parinishpanna, paratantra, or parikalpita. As perfected, reality is ultimate reality or thusness, tatata. Thus, the ālaya in its perfected state is pure consciousness, totally undifferentiated and undefiled. It is this state which a supposedly existent individual person would reach upon attaining nirvana. Nirvana is the return to the one, the cessation of the wave on the surface of the ālaya. The ālaya in its dependent nature, however, is a continuously defiled, by mind and sensations, an appearance-causing consciousness, which causes the totally unreal imagined nature of consciousness as an empirical subject living within an object-laden world. Mind and sensations, along with subjects and world, are reality in its imagined state. In fact, of course, unreality mistakenly seen as reality. One problem which the unitary view of the ālaya must face is how an ultimately unitary ālaya is differentiated into a plurality of different but concurrent consciousnesses or ego subjects. If consciousness is an ever-flowing single stream, as the Yogacarans would maintain, can it serve to ground the diversity of the dharmic series which constitute the individual ego's consciousnesses? As one ālaya, it should apparently give rise to simultaneous ego subjects, which are the same, and which lack all distinctions. This is obviously not the case, for the many ego subjects are seemingly unique in the illusory characters they have, the illusory actions they perform, and so on. I myself, as a series of momentary dharmas, am distinct and different from you. Consequently, the unitariness of the ālaya must be interpreted in a way which can account for the divergencies in its waves. Let us look more closely at the momentariness of the ālaya. As pure flowing consciousness, the ālaya is surely beyond description. The moment we say that it flows, we are leaning toward an entitative image in which we see something which constantly changes. Yet this is precisely not the nature of pure consciousness. In apprehending pure consciousness as one, we might imagine again something which is immutable and possibly lacking in all determinations. But of course the ālaya is not an entity in any sense of substantiality, either as an underlying substrate of changes or as an immutable substance with a quasi-divine nature. Yet constant change and immutable indetermination both seem to be characteristics of the ālaya, although they are seemingly incompatible without a grounding substance theory. Can non-entitative consciousness be both constantly changing in its determinations and immutably indetermined? For that is precisely how we want to interpret the ālaya in its pure reality. We would like to say that the ālaya is both momentary and unitary, since as unitary it can nonetheless ground the multiplicity of ego subjects in the sense that, in its dependent nature, it contains all the possible seeds which can give rise to such defiled consciousnesses. There is another related difficulty which follows from the above argument, that is, the seemingly temporal character of the ālaya, especially as it relates to the problem of the relation between the ālaya and its seeds. This character appears most strongly when the Yogacarans employ the image of a stream or an ocean with waves to describe the nature of the ālaya. For example, Vasubandhu notes in his 30 verses, the Trimshika, the ālaya is always flowing like a torrent. The image ably emphasizes both the persisting existence and the non-substantial characteristics of the ālaya. Like a stream or torrent, it continuously flows on, or perhaps more accurately, there is a continuous flowing, not something is continuously flowing. Also, like the stream, it undergoes continuous change or transformation. Recall Heraclitus's river. From one perspective, such transformation can be seen as the result of the constant changeover of the momentary seeds carried by the ālaya stream. But as noted earlier, a clear-cut equivalence does not exist between the ālaya and its seeds. The ālaya is not momentary simply because each of the seeds is, yet in each of its moments it is causing and being caused anew. From another perspective, the change of the ālaya could be accounted for by its nature as a flow. A flowing is never the same, quite apart from whatever it carries along with it. But as mentioned earlier, the ālaya cannot be completely separated from its seeds. So too, neither can its changeability be completely separable from the momentariness of its seeds. Leaving aside the recurrent dialectical imagery of this description of the ālaya, let us look more closely at the difficulty which I termed the seemingly temporal character of the ālaya. A superficial understanding of the flowing image of the ālaya might lead one who is familiar with Western metaphysics to interpret this image as giving the ālaya a similarity to, if not an identity with, time. For the Westerner, change implies duration, which in turn implies a length of time which measures this duration. But for the Yogacaran, time is as unreal as the object which apparently subsists through change within this time. Any empirical notion of time, of clock time, the time of the universe, and the movement of its bodies, charted in years, months, days, and so forth, is rejected as a construct of mind, manas. Consequently, the ālaya cannot be termed temporal in the usual sense, nor can it be termed eternal, if eternity means endless endurance through time. If the ālaya is in any sense temporal, the nature of this characteristic must be elucidated by means of a more primordial sense of time and or temporality. Now, I suggest that the apparent tension, if not contradiction, between a plurality of momentary determinations and an immutably indeterminate unity can be better understood if we introduce a perspective on time foreign to the letter of Yogacara thought as such. This perspective, the time of absolute consciousness, is found in Husserlian phenomenology. We will now sketch the relevant features of this notion of time. 2. Husserl's doctrine of time as flux. The core of Husserl's theory of inner time consciousness is found in his 1905 lectures Towards the Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness. In these lectures, Husserl approaches the discussion of time from the point of view of experience. Time is not merely a scientifically objective topic, something apart from the experiencing subject. Experience time is the time of living experience, Erlebnis, sensings, thinkings, willings, of our subjective inwardness, rather than the time of objects, of a physical universe subject to putative natural laws. Experience time, however, cannot be equated with what might be termed a factual psychological time. For example, a person's subjective measurement of a duration of time, the feeling that this hour went faster than the last hour. Husserl's more radical position on time presents a point of view which can be applied to the Yogacara philosophy, despite its rejection of time as an objective measure of passing moments. For Husserl, inner time is most fundamentally consciousness self-constituting itself. At this level, inner time is aware of itself in its own conscious flow, and consequently generates itself and all experiences as temporal. Husserl names this consciousness the flux to emphasize its primordiality. This consciousness of inner time is both multiphased and synthesized as a unity, many yet one. The former characteristic refers to a composition of many phases of the flow, for example, consciousness of the present moment, of a past moment as just past, called retention, of a future moment, called protension. However, these different phases do not comprise a series of really discrete moments, for all phases are fundamentally interconnected. Inner time consciousness has a synthetic unity which derives from the fact that each phase occurs all at once within the consciousness of the now. This occurrence all at once is within a living present which Husserl distinguishes from the present of the now point. The painfully brief discussion of the preceding paragraph illustrates the difficulty in describing a phenomenon which in some sense both is and is not temporal. As Husserl notes, names are lacking for the absolute characteristics of the flux of inner time consciousness, even though we often speak of it in terms which are normally used to describe the constituted stream of experience rather than the constituting flux. As we have seen, the Yogacaran avoids this problem of description by the use of metaphorical descriptions which lack specific temporal terminology, but which imply some type of non-serial temporality. For example, the ālaya is like an ocean with its waves, or a stream with its rippling current. Husserl naturally avoids such images, but he nonetheless attempts to describe the flux. It is, for example, not an object, a process, or any kind of thing which alters or persists. The flux is not in time, it is not itself temporal in the usual sense. Since the flux is not in time, it is said to be all at once, a phrase which itself is subject to the misinterpretation inherent in using time talk. Also, Husserl equates the flux with absolute consciousness. Because of this equivalence of the flux with absolute consciousness, the flux cannot be considered a metaphysical principle independent of consciousness. The flux is consciousness taken in its absolute sense. Therefore, in some difficult-to-understand yet important sense, it parallels the Yogacaran view of pure consciousness as the absolute or perfected reality. The concept of all at once is based on the notion of the living present, a highly complex concept in Husserl's later philosophy of time. For our purposes, the living present may be described as the active focus of the self-differentiation of absolute consciousness, also termed transcendental subjectivity, encompassing both an undifferentiated beginning and the differentiations of the streaming flow of inner time, present consciousness, retention, and protension. Flux, as all at once, is the living present, a unified synthesis of differentiated moments. This concept of the flux is crucial for our interpretation of the ālaya as unitary yet momentary, undifferentiated yet distinguished. I will return to this interpretation in the next section, but now I would like to draw several parallels between the constituting character of the flux and the causal character of the ālaya. First, in Husserl's phenomenological discussion of the constitution of the ego, we may differentiate two meanings of ego and constitution. 1. The constitution of an empirical ego, psychological ego as a temporal and historical being, and 2. The constitution of the transcendental ego as absolute consciousness. The first type is dependent on the second type, just as for the Yogacaran, the appearance of a mundane ego is dependent on the ālaya consciousness. Furthermore, the constitution of the transcendental ego is the self-constitution of the flux. And although the Yogacarans have no parallel to the concept of self-constitution, their absolute would at least be independent in its being, a concept analogous to Husserl's notion of self-constitution. Second, for Husserl, the flux is not simply a non-personal stream of experience. It is personal. It is always someone's ego. This ego or transcendental subjectivity, not to be confused with the empirical ego, serves as repository of its past in the sense that the ego both has its living experiences and retains them in retentional modifications within its unconscious, the repository of experiences and their contents which are no longer held in retentional modifications. The ego also has the future as its protensional horizon, as the horizon of its possibilities. The ego in this sense is termed monad, exhibiting its own concreteness by constituting itself as a being with temporally constituted experiences which stretch in two directions from the present. And it lives these experiences all at once as the living present. At first sight, the transcendental ego seen from this perspective may appear as a substantial entity quite unlike the Yogacara ālaya. But for Husserl, the transcendental ego is not a substance in the usual sense. Its concreteness is defined within the flashpoint of the living present, and consequently it does not require any characteristics proper to a substantial entity. Again, the Yogacarans use metaphor to eke out a description detailing how the non-substantial ālaya is affected by and affects non-realities. It stores seeds, it is perfumed by seeds, and so on. Yet for both Husserl and the Yogacarans there remains the difficulty of relating a basically non-substantial being with seemingly substantial characteristics. Third, and finally, in relation to the absolute consciousness as monad, Husserl's description of the workings of inner time consciousness includes the element of genesis. In the post-ideas writings, Husserl frequently states that sense, Sinn, has a genesis, or history. Sense is the correlate of constituting consciousness. It is the object as experienced. To say that sense has a sense genesis is to indicate a pointing back or reference to something more original, and consequently something prior to the sense under investigation. This prior element is the acts, or noesis,
which originally constituted that sense. In other words, no object of consciousness occurs isolated from previous experiences. At another point, Husserl describes the genesis of a judgment as its intentional motivational foundations. The notion of genesis as foundation indicates that the presently investigated sense points back to something original, which serves as a foundation for the current sense. This foundation must be present in the structure of the ego for the current sense to be constituted at all. Consequently, it is a necessary condition for the current sense and its constituting acts. This characteristic of the genetic structure of the monad recalls the necessary presence of particular seeds in the ālaya, in order that a particular mode of consciousness and or object may appear. The seeds perfume the ālaya, and as a result of this perfuming, the ālaya causes certain phenomena. The ālaya, then, in its causal character, is comparable to genesis as foundational for sense constitution. But genesis as foundation is not merely a condition for the current sense. It is also motivational, as mentioned in the earlier quotation, in the sense that it provides an impulsion or inducement toward the production of the new founded sense. The term motivation gives genesis a further significance, since the term implies that the foundation is not only a necessary precondition for, but also an effective element in, the constitution of the current sense. This motivational aspect thus parallels the Yogacara emphasis on the mutual causation between the ālaya and its seeds. The seeds of past actions fall into the ālaya, perfume it, and consequently motivate the ālaya to cause further actions conditioned by the past actions. Both the theory of the ālaya and of genesis can account for the consistency within the empirical ego and its experiences of the spatio-temporal world. While inner time consciousness gives the formal conditions for the temporal existence of the ego, both empirical and transcendental, the notion of genesis explains the determinations of the material and concrete aspects of living experience. Similarly, the concept of ālaya as pure flow provides the formal grounds for the apparent existence of an empirical ego and the spatio-temporal world, and also explains the origin of the concrete, consistent experiences within this world. 3. Final comparison and conclusion. At this point, we can state the explanatory value of Husserl's doctrine of inner time for an interpretation of the Yogacara ālayavijñāna, since for Husserl, transcendental consciousness is not in empirical time. It is not itself empirical, nor are its concretions within the genetic structure empirical. These structures explain not only the source of empirical time, but also the development of a concrete empirical ego. In this way, Husserl's doctrine parallels that of the ālaya, which is the cause of the consciousness of a real world and of differentiated empirical ego subjects experiencing themselves as existent in that spatio-temporal realm. Thus far, however, we have mentioned only the surface parallels between flux and ālaya. The Yogacara doctrine does not specifically introduce the notion of a quasi-temporal characteristic for the ālaya, similar to the inner time of Husserlian transcendental consciousness. It is at this point, then, that the Husserlian analysis may be helpful in understanding and expanding the ālaya doctrine, specifically for the clarification and resolution of the problem raised at the end of Section 1. Clearly, the ālaya is not in empirical time. Reality cannot have the non-real characteristic of empirical temporality. But as noted earlier, the descriptions of the ālaya possess a time-like character. Could this character be understood as something similar to the inner time consciousness in Husserl? By such a comparison, we may discover that at least some, although not all, of the ambiguousness of the ālaya's character will be dispersed. Husserl's explanation of inner time consciousness would be most relevant to the problem of whether the ālaya is one or many. If we consider the flux as the core of the self-constitution of Husserl's transcendental consciousness, we find a single undifferentiated beginning which grounds all differentiations of sense constituted by it as transcendental consciousness. How does Husserl allow for this movement from an undifferentiated oneness, the flow, to differentiated multiplicity? The answer to this question clarifies the nature of the flux, to the extent that clarification is possible for a being with no names. The flux, although resembling an undifferentiated oneness, has a double reality. Husserl attempts to capture the nature of the flux by terming it the living present. This living present is characterized as both standing and streaming. Husserl notes in an unpublished manuscript from 1932, "The primordial level of consciousness is a stream which stands and streams, which streams in a constantly invariable form. So that, however, in the streaming a doubled present constitutes itself, the present of the respective worldly perceiving, and the present of this perceiving simultaneously with the retentions and protensions of the perceptions just past and just coming. Transcendental consciousness is basically a double constitutive reality. Within its oneness as living present, it differentiates itself in the twofold character of standing and streaming. Such a differentiation grounds all further differentiations, both on the level of the primal temporality of conscious experiences and on the empirical and founded level of objective temporality, the empirical ego and its experiences. Thus, its oneness is at once one and many. If such a characterization is allowed, an ontological source of the constituted world of experience emerges, which overcomes the difficulties posed by the problem of the one and the many with respect to the ālaya. In applying this characterization of the temporality of transcendental consciousness to the ālaya, we could continue to maintain the Buddhistic emphasis on a single, rationally inexplicable source of being, while giving some concrete analysis of the nature of this source as a source of multiplicity. The ālaya can thus be seen as the living present, which is not an empirical flow, but exists as the source of all present empirical egos and their supposedly contemporaneously present empirical worlds. The streaming characteristic of the living present adequately reflects the nature of the ālaya as flowing. The standing characteristic emphasizes the atemporality, or as Husserl puts it, the quasi-transtemporality and unity of the ālaya. It also allows for the unitary nature of all differentiations which flow causally from the ālaya. For example, the fact that all empirical ego subjects seem to experience basically the same, non-real, empirical world. By using the dialectical character of the living present, we could thus explicate the ālaya as one reality, which by its nature is fundamentally differentiated into a multiplicity of temporal modes. From this primal differentiation, the higher-level differentiations into the multiplicity of empirical ego subjects would follow, all sharing the same ontological source, yet not all sharing the same empirical experiences or dharmic characters. Each wave of the ālaya would echo only certain aspects of the total range of higher-level differentiations. In Husserl, genetic contents. Thus, the ālaya, in its dependent or apparent nature, is many. In its true reality, one. To recapitulate, the living present is both standing and streaming. As standing, it is the one, the now, through which flow all differentiated living experiences and their contents, my experience of the spatio-temporal world and of myself as existing empirical subject, and so forth. As streaming, it is the many, self-differentiating itself into a multi-phased stream of temporality which occurs all at once, thus serving as source for the multiple experiences within empirical time and space. Although Husserl does not equate the constitution by transcendental consciousness with a complete constitution of all beings in their being, in a metaphysically committed sense, the use of his analysis to explicate the Yogacara ālaya would be combined with a metaphysical claim, namely that the ālaya in its true or perfected state as thusness is the source of being, real and unreal, of all other entities. This comparative effort, while not fully integrating the Yogacara ālayavijñāna into the phenomenological framework, nevertheless can supplement the discussion of the ālaya and perhaps obviate some of the difficulties inherent in its interpretation.